Again, this is Elisande. Today what I'm going to be showing is how to create a relatively basic icon weak aura that's tied to a couple of different triggers. So I want to set up some context here. I currently have a bunch of weak auras for a feral DPS rotation on a druid. And right now this one is set up, there's a big empty space in my rotation right here, and that is because I originally created this rotation to have Brutal Slash talent in it, which is this right here. So if we click on Brutal Slash, then the weak aura should pop up. So we have to expand this to be able to see it. Okay, there it is. So there's the Brutal Slash weak aura, but it doesn't load if you don't have this talent enabled. So now you can see that it's still here, but if we close out of weak auras, you'll see that it doesn't show up because we do not have Brutal Slash trained. So there it is. So when we don't have Brutal Slash, what we want instead is to have Thrash as part of our rotation. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a button for Thrash, and the goal is to have it only show Thrash when Thrash is not applied to our current target, unless refreshing the Thrash debuff would not result in a damage loss, which sounds very complicated, but it turns out that it's a little more simplistic than you might think. So let's start by creating our initial weak aura. So what we're going to start from is the new auras button. And most of my weak auras that I do are icons. I think icons are the most basic type, really. The other parts here have varying levels of complexity, but a lot of times icon is all you need. So we'll click on icon. The first thing that it's going to do is ask you to provide a name for this. We're going to call this Thrash. And right now it's got this kind of ugly question mark icon, but we're going to fix that here in just a moment. So it immediately drops you on this pretty complicated display tab. There's lots and lots of options here that have lots and lots of things that you can do with them, but we're going to keep it relatively simple for this. I don't like how big this button is, so if we look at comparative to our other buttons down here, like this button is huge, and so I want to make it smaller. So the default width and height are here of 64 and 64. Turns out these smaller versions are just half of that. So we're going to go 32, 32. There we go. So that makes the button the size we want. Now to move it around, we can just click and drag and move it around on the screen as to where we want to drop it. We're going to drop it directly over Brutal Slash here, but for right now, we'll leave it above so it's easier to see and follow what's going on. Okay. For right now, that's all we're going to do on this display tab. We might come back to it later on, but for now, we'll just only do that. Next is the trigger tab. Trigger tab is the most important one. Trigger says, when should you see this button? Is what it's primarily involved with. So in this particular case, let's start off with a simple one. We want it to show the Thrash button when Thrash is not applied to our primary target. So we see here the default type of this is aura, the default target is player, and the default type is buff. So if you were wanting to see if a buff was applied to yourself, these default settings would work well for you. But we actually want the opposite. So in this case, we want to know if on our target, if there is a debuff applied, and that debuff is Thrash. So in order to, now we've got target and debuff, now we need to figure out how do we tie this to Thrash. There's two ways to do it. The way that will work 90% of the time for you is this one that says names, and then you just type in the name of the ability that you want to put in there. So in this case, Thrash. There we go. Now you notice a couple of things, one of which is the icon changed. It's now the Thrash icon instead of that weird question mark looking thing. And that's because by default, whatever ability your first trigger references is the one that it picks for the icon. You can customize that, but in most cases you don't need to. All right, so we're going to come down here and we're going to say we need to figure out what other options we want to turn on here. So we can skip most of these. There are things like stat count, remaining time, tooltip information, whether or not the ability is stealable. These are all pretty edge case kind of things. We'll end up using remaining time later. But a very important one is this one that says own only. If this is not clicked, that means any other druid's thrash will be considered for this trigger. And we don't want that. We only want our own thrash because that's the one that's important to us. So we're going to click own only here. And then the last one you see show on, and we have a drop down here. So you can pick a number of options here. Always, which means the button will just always show. Or a found, which means that the debuff is on the enemy. Match count, which means the enemy has the number of stacks that you want. Or aura missing, which means it's not on our target. We want aura missing because we want this button to show up when the enemy does not have thrash applied to them. So let's click aura missing. All right, so we're going to add a second trigger to this, but for right now, let's test out our weak aura and see if it works correctly. So we're just going to close out here. And we see that right now we're targeting this target dummy, and the weak aura shows up. So we're going to go over to the rated dummy, and we're just going to hit thrash. You can see now our button has gone away, and that's because thrash is now applied to our primary target here. All right, let's open our weak auras back up. So now that's part of it, but now there's a second part, right? We want the thrash button to show up when thrash isn't applied, or when we can safely reapply it without losing any damage. Now, if you look at the Icy Veins article for this, they have a list down at the bottom of every druid dot and at how many seconds remaining can you refresh it without losing any damage. It turns out that it's exactly the same amount of time as Rake, because Rake has the same duration that Thrash does. So we'll just go to our Rake to find out what that is. And that's aura missing. It's also aura missing. Okay, so it must be this one. Let's see. Yeah, so it looks like we can refresh it as long as it has 4.5 seconds or less remaining without losing any damage. So this is the next trigger we're going to add to Thrash. So we have the first trigger which says, hey, show this if there is not Thrash on the target. The second one we're going to set it up the same way. We're going to say target. We're going to say debuff. We're going to put our name in as Thrash again. But this time, we're going to use this remaining time checkbox. So we'll check this. We'll say if the remaining time is less than or equal to 4.5 seconds, and it's our own Thrash, nobody else's, and the aura is found, which means that Thrash is on the enemy, then we want this to show. All right, so that gives us our second aura. Now, if we try and test this out, you'll see that it doesn't work the way that we expect. So you can see that our button is not showing up, even though the enemy does not have Thrash on them. And even if we apply it, we're going to see that the button doesn't show up when it gets low either. See, our button is not showing up, even though Thrash is now low. So let's talk about why this is. So the reason for this is we have two triggers defined now. One that says, show this when Thrash is not on the enemy, and one that says, show this if Thrash is on the enemy and there's less than 4.5 seconds remaining. But the problem is, if we look at required for activation here, it says all triggers. That means right now this will only show if the buff, or if Thrash is not on the enemy and also has less than 4.5 seconds remaining. That's never going to happen, because if they don't have the debuff on them, then it's not going to have any time remaining. So right now, those two things are fighting. But we can change this from all triggers to any triggers. This means if either of the two conditions are true, then the button will show up, which is what we're hoping for. So let's close out of this again, and now we can test our weak aura. All right, we clicked on the dummy and our button showed up, which is good. That's what we expected. Let's go ahead and thrash. Now when our bar starts glowing down here, we expect the button to come back up. Let's see if it does. There it is, right there. All right, so let's back off here. So there you go. All that's left for us to do is to drag Thrash down into the correct position, which should be right on top of the Brutal Slash here. Luckily, these lines help you line up icons on a grid. So if we drop this, it will snap into place over the Brutal Slash. And now if we click this off, whoop. Well, it's aligning itself on something else there, not what we wanted. There we go, okay. And now you can see Thrash is showing up in our rotation exactly as we planned. So we'll rake, we'll thrash, we'll stab a couple of times, we'll rip. And there we go. So that's a fairly basic intro. For something like a cooldown that you just want to show the button whenever it's available, it's slightly easier, but I think in most cases you're looking for one or two triggers on a button. So I hope this walkthrough gives you an idea of how to do that. Feel free, of course, to rewind to see each individual step if you want to learn more about it. You can also just reach out to me as well. All right, that's it. Thank you so much, and I will talk to you later.